The war ended so quietly that Elias Reed almost missed it. One moment he was standing inside the tactical chamber of the command carrier Resolute, staring at a wall of glowing star maps, and the next moment every hostile signal across 3 sectors vanished at once. Red markers flickered, dimmed, and turned blue as surrender protocols rippled across the battlefield like a slow-moving tide. No explosions, no heroic speeches, just silence. Reed leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. After 5 years of calculating fleet movements and predicting alien strategies, the final victory looked suspiciously like a computer glitch. "Did we win?" asked Lieutenant Alvarez from the navigation console. Reed studied the map again. The enemy armada, once arranged in a carefully layered defensive grid, had folded inward exactly as he predicted. Their supply routes collapsed, their command relays isolated, and their retreat corridors sealed by the Alliance's smallest but fastest strike wing. "Yes," Reed said slowly. "Either we won the war, or the galaxy just decided to take a very dramatic nap." Alvarez stared at the display, then laughed nervously. "Sir, the entire coalition fleet is transmitting surrender codes." Reed nodded. "Good. That means the paperwork phase of the war can begin." The lieutenant blinked. "The paperwork phase?" Reed stood up, stretching stiff muscles that had forgotten what comfort felt like. "Lieutenant, wars are easy. Bureaucracy is where the real suffering begins." Within hours, the news spread across the fleet. The Galactic Alliance had won the war. The enemy coalition had surrendered. Entire star systems celebrated with fireworks powerful enough to be seen from orbit. Reed, however, spent most of the celebrations trying to avoid being congratulated. Unfortunately, the universe had other plans. 2 days later, he stood inside a ceremonial chamber on the Capitol station, surrounded by diplomats, admirals, journalists, and more decorative banners than any military victory reasonably required. The hall was enormous, its curved walls covered with holographic projections of the battle that Reed had just ended. Apparently, someone had decided the quiet tactical maneuver needed dramatic visual effects. A tall admiral stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Reed's shoulder. "Today we honor the man whose strategy ended the Galactic War," the admiral announced proudly. Reed considered correcting the statement, but decided it would probably extend the ceremony. Polite applause echoed through the chamber. Reed glanced toward the exit and briefly considered calculating the fastest escape route. Unfortunately, several guards were already positioned there. He sighed quietly. "Now," the admiral continued, "the Alliance presents its highest reward." 2 armored escorts entered the chamber. Between them walked a woman. At first glance, she looked almost human. Her posture was straight and controlled, her expression calm, her eyes sharp with the alert focus of a trained officer. But one detail made it immediately clear she was not human. Her ears were long and elegant, extending backward in a smooth curve that gave her face an otherworldly grace. The room fell silent. Reed blinked. The admiral gestured proudly. "This is Commander Ka'ari of the former Coalition fleet, a high-ranking officer captured during the final surrender." Ka'ara stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Reed felt a sudden and deeply uncomfortable suspicion forming in his mind. The admiral continued with enthusiastic confidence. "As tradition dictates, the victor of the war is granted a living symbol of triumph. Commander Ka'ara will serve as your personal war prize." The silence that followed was so complete that Reed could hear the quiet hum of the station's gravity generators. He looked at Ka'ara. She looked at him. Several diplomats smiled politely, apparently expecting Reed to say something inspiring. Reed slowly leaned closer to Ka'ara and lowered his voice. "I have a terrible feeling," he whispered, "that neither of us agreed to this." Ka'ara's expression did not change, but one eyebrow lifted slightly. "You are correct," she replied quietly. "This is the first time I am hearing the details." Reed exhaled slowly. "Excellent," he murmured. "Nothing builds a healthy diplomatic relationship like mutual confusion." The admiral clapped Reed on the back again. "Well, soldier, what do you say?" Reed looked around the chamber at the smiling officials, the recording drones, and the enormous holograms showing fleets exploding in heroic slow motion. Then he looked back at Ka'ara. She remained perfectly composed, though there was something sharp in her gaze now, something that looked suspiciously like restrained annoyance. Reed cleared his throat. "Admiral," he said carefully, "with respect, I'm not entirely comfortable owning another person." A ripple of uncomfortable whispers spread through the room. The Admiral chuckled as if Reed had made a charming joke. "Oh, it's only ceremonial, Reed. A proud tradition." Ka'ara spoke before Reed could respond. "Your traditions," she said calmly, "are fascinating." Reed glanced at her. "Is that sarcasm?" he asked quietly. Ka'ara tilted her head slightly. "In my culture," she replied, "sarcasm is considered a diplomatic skill." Reed almost smiled. The Admiral gestured impatiently toward a hovering console displaying legal documents. "All that remains is the acceptance confirmation." Reed stared at the glowing text. Across the chamber, cameras focused on him. Beside him, Ka'ara waited in absolute silence. Reed leaned toward her again. "I suspect," he whispered, "that rejecting this might cause problems." Ka'ara nodded slightly. "In my case," she said calmly, "rejection would result in immediate execution." Reed froze. He stared at the console again. The war had ended only 2 days ago, and somehow the galaxy had already managed to create a situation worse than the battlefield. The console hovered in front of Reed like a quiet threat. A pale blue light illuminated the words, "Acceptance Confirmation," while a blinking icon patiently waited for his fingerprint. Around him, the chamber held its breath. Diplomats smiled the polite smiles of people who had already decided how the story would end. Cameras floated closer, their tiny lenses adjusting focus with soft mechanical clicks. Reed stared at the console. Then he sighed. "Admiral," he said slowly, "hypothetically speaking, if someone refused this reward, what would happen?" The Admiral folded his hands behind his back, clearly pleased with the question. "Well, regulations are quite clear," he said. "If the prize is rejected, the captured officer loses protected status." Reed glanced at Ka'ara. She stood beside him, motionless, her long ears angled slightly backward, like quiet antennae listening to a storm. "And losing protected status means?" Reed asked. "Execution," the Admiral replied cheerfully. Reed rubbed his face. "Of course it does." The Admiral looked confused. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," Reed said. "Just appreciating the efficiency of the system." Ka'ara spoke without looking at the Admiral. "In fairness," she said calmly, "your people are not the only ones who maintain cruel traditions." Reed tilted his head slightly. "That was surprisingly diplomatic." "I am a trained officer," she replied. "I insult systems, not individuals." Reed nodded approvingly. "That's a useful skill." The Admiral cleared his throat loudly. "Commander Reed, the ceremony must continue." Reed stared at the glowing console again. His mind ran through possibilities the way it had during the war. Calculating outcomes, predicting consequences, mapping invisible paths through complicated systems. Rejecting her meant death. Accepting her meant participating in a legal absurdity that made his skin crawl. He leaned slightly toward Ka'ara. "Do you happen to know any legal loopholes?" he whispered. Ka'ara considered the console thoughtfully. "My expertise is battlefield command," she replied, "but I once escaped a supply audit that lasted 14 hours. Reed blinked. "That sounds more terrifying than the war." "Correct." The Admiral's patience was evaporating. "Commander Reed." Reed placed his hand on the console. The scanner glowed briefly. A soft tone chimed. "Acceptance recorded." Applause erupted across the chamber. Reed closed his eyes for a moment. "Congratulations," Ka'ara murmured quietly beside him. "You now officially own a very annoyed alien officer." Reed opened one eye. "I feel the need to clarify something immediately." "Yes?" "You are not my property." Ka'ara glanced sideways at him. "Unfortunately," she said, "Galactic law disagrees." Reed scratched the back of his neck. "Galactic law also thought the war would last another 20 years. She paused. "That is a fair point." The Admiral clapped loudly. "A magnificent moment in Alliance history." Reed forced a thin smile. "History will definitely remember this moment," he muttered. 2 hours later, Reed stood in a quiet transport corridor aboard the capital station. The celebration noises were far away now, replaced by the steady hum of engines and life support systems. Kyara stood beside him, watching the stars through a long observation window. For the first time since the ceremony, neither of them were surrounded by politicians. Reed leaned against the wall. "So," he said, "how does one begin a conversation like this?" Kyara kept watching the stars. "In my culture," she said calmly, "the person responsible for the awkward situation usually begins." Reed nodded. "Excellent. That would be the admiral." She almost smiled. Reed exhaled slowly. "Look," he said, "I didn't know they were going to do that." "I know. You seem very calm about the possibility of execution." Kyara finally turned toward him. Her eyes were sharp, focused, intelligent. "A captured officer prepares for several unpleasant outcomes," she said. "Execution was simply the most efficient." Reed stared at her. "That might be the most unsettling sentence I've heard this week." "Your week included a galactic war." "Fair point." He pushed himself away from the wall and paced slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's review our situation." Kyara folded her arms. "You legally accepted ownership of me." "Yes." "If you attempt to revoke the claim, I lose protected status." "Yes." "If we do nothing, I remain your property." Reed winced. "Yes." They both stood silently for a moment. Then Reed snapped his fingers. "Good news?" Kyara raised an eyebrow. "I enjoy good news. I'm very good at dismantling bad systems." She tilted her head slightly. "You dismantled our entire war strategy in 3 weeks." "Exactly." Reed gestured toward the distant government towers visible through the station's windows. "So now we dismantle that." Kyara followed his gaze. "The legal structure of the Galactic Alliance." "Yes. That system has existed for 3 centuries." Reed nodded. "I know." She studied him carefully. "You sound confident." "I won a war using supply routes and bad timing," Reed said. "This is just another strategy puzzle." Kyara looked at him for several seconds. Then she sighed softly. "You realize," she said, "that this may involve confronting half the leadership of your civilization." Reed shrugged. "I've already annoyed an admiral today. I'm on a streak." For the first time, Kyara actually laughed. It was quiet but genuine. Reed smiled. "That's the first encouraging sound I've heard since the ceremony." Kyara's expression settled back into calm focus. "Very well, tactician." She extended her hand. "If we are to dismantle an interstellar legal tradition, we should probably begin with research." Reed shook her hand. "Agreed." They both looked back out at the stars. The war had ended, but somehow Reed had the strange feeling that the real battle was only beginning, and this one involved far more paperwork. The diplomatic station orbiting the neutral world of Histara looked less like a government facility and more like an elaborate sculpture floating in space. Long silver arcs curved around a central sphere, and transparent corridors connected its sections like delicate strands of glass. From a distance, it appeared graceful. From inside, Reed suspected it had been designed by someone who hated straight hallways. He stood inside one of those corridors, holding a datapad and staring at a legal document that was currently attempting to defeat him. Kyara walked beside him, her steps quiet and steady. "How many pages is that?" she asked. Reed scrolled down. "It stopped counting after 4,000. Kyara nodded thoughtfully. "An impressive weapon." Reed glanced sideways. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Immensely." The corridor curved gently, revealing a massive chamber ahead, where dozens of diplomats floated through holographic displays and conversation clusters. Several of them immediately noticed Reed and quickly pretended to be busy studying unrelated star charts. Reed sighed. "Look at them," he muttered. "Every single one suddenly remembers they have urgent paperwork." Kyara tilted her head slightly. "You are the man who dismantled the coalition fleet in 3 weeks." "Yes. You are now publicly challenging a 300-year-old legal tradition." "Yes." She considered the room again. "They are afraid you might succeed." Reed scratched the back of his neck. "That's a strange reputation to have." They entered the chamber together. The air carried the faint hum of translation drones, each one adjusting conversations into dozens of languages simultaneously. At the center of the room, a massive holographic display projected the official treaty framework of the Galactic Alliance. Layers of legal structure floated like glowing architecture in midair. Reed stared at it. "Tell me honestly," he said quietly. "Does anyone actually understand this thing?" Ka'ara studied the structure. "No." Reed blinked. "You didn't even hesitate. Confidence is important in diplomacy." He rubbed his temples. "This entire system is built like a tactical fortress, layers inside layers. Your species enjoys complexity. My species enjoys pretending complexity is intelligence." Ka'ara folded her arms and walked slowly around the holographic structure. Several nearby diplomats quietly moved farther away as she approached. Reed noticed. "Are they avoiding you?" he asked. "Or me?" Ka'ara glanced at a retreating ambassador. "Possibly both." Reed chuckled. "Excellent. That means we're making progress." They stopped near the lowest level of the treaty display. Thousands of legal clauses floated there like tiny satellites. Ka'ara pointed at one section. "There!" Reed leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" "The War Assets Transfer Protocol." Reed groaned. "That sounds exactly like the thing I hate." She expanded the section with a gesture. The hologram zoomed in, revealing lines of glowing text. Reed read silently for several seconds. Then he groaned again. "This isn't a reward system," he said. "It's psychological warfare." Ka'ara nodded. "It was designed to demonstrate dominance after a conflict." "Yeah," Reed said. "Nothing says peace like legalized humiliation." A small service drone floated past carrying drinks. Reed grabbed one absent-mindedly. Ka'ara glanced at the glass. "What is that?" "Coffee. Is it safe?" "No," Reed said, "but it keeps humans functional." He took a sip and immediately winced. "That might actually be fuel." Ka'ara watched him carefully. "Your people drink this voluntarily?" Reed nodded weakly. "During the war we had a version strong enough to melt spoons. Your species is terrifying." They returned their attention to the holographic document. Reed began pacing slowly. "Okay," he said. "Every system has pressure points. Like a fleet formation." "Exactly." He zoomed into a specific clause. "This section defines war prizes as strategic assets." Ka'ara leaned closer. "That classification allows them to maintain control over conquered officers." "Right." Reed tapped the air, highlighting several related clauses. "But these sections also define sentient individuals as sovereign entities under alliance law." Ka'ara's eyes sharpened. "That is contradictory." Reed grinned slightly. "Yes, it is." Across the chamber, a group of diplomats quietly watched them. One of them whispered something urgently into a communicator. Ka'ara noticed. "You are attracting attention." Reed shrugged. "I'm dismantling a 3-century-old legal structure. Attention seems appropriate." She studied the holographic network again. "If you challenge this clause," she said slowly, "the entire War Assets Protocol collapses." Reed nodded. "Exactly." Ka'ara was silent for a moment. "You are planning to attack the Foundation. That's usually the fastest way." She glanced at him. "Your enemies must have hated you." Reed smiled faintly. "They still do." He took another sip of coffee and made a face. "That definitely came from a reactor." Ka'ara almost smiled again. "Your strategy may succeed," she said thoughtfully. Reed looked up at the towering holographic structure. "Maybe. But what?" "You will make powerful enemies." Reed glanced around the chamber. Several ambassadors were now openly watching them. "Ka'ara," he said quietly. "Yes?" "I already defeated the people trying to kill me." He gestured toward the diplomats. "These ones only write angry letters." She considered that. "That is a reasonable risk assessment." Reed straightened and expanded the holographic display even further. Layers of law unfolded above them, like glowing architecture, stretching toward the ceiling. "Well," he said, cracking his knuckles lightly, "let's start dismantling the galaxy." Ka'ara looked at the immense legal structure. Then she nodded once. "Very well, tactician." And together they began their first assault, not with fleets, not with weapons, but with loopholes. The diplomatic station had a quiet hour that most people never noticed. It happened when the central star of the Hestera system rotated behind the gas giant below the station, flooding the observation rings with a deep amber light that filtered through the transparent hull. During that time, the diplomats usually retreated to private meetings, the communication traffic slowed, and the station felt almost peaceful. Reed had discovered this by accident 3 days ago while trying to escape a senator who insisted on explaining the historical importance of ceremonial war traditions for 40 uninterrupted minutes. Now he used the quiet hour like a soldier uses cover. He sat at a circular table in one of the station's research rooms, surrounded by floating holographic screens. Thousands of legal lines hovered in the air, glowing softly like a swarm of obedient fireflies. Ka'ara stood across from him, studying another projection. Reed rubbed his eyes. "Tell me something," he said. "Yes?" "Did your people ever fight a war using legal documents instead of fleets?" Ka'ara considered the question. "No." Reed leaned back in his chair. "I'm beginning to suspect this is the more dangerous battlefield." Ka'ara flicked 2 fingers through the holographic display, rearranging several treaty clauses. "In a normal war," she said, "the enemy usually tries to destroy you quickly." "Yes. In this war," she continued, "they schedule meetings." Reed shuddered. "Cruel." A small hovering assistant drone floated past them, carrying stacks of digital tablets. Reed grabbed one without looking. The screen immediately filled with dense legal text. He stared at it for several seconds. "Who writes this stuff?" Ka'ara glanced over. "Lawyers." "That explains everything." He scrolled slowly. The document described the war asset transfer protocol in painful detail. Hundreds of lines explaining ownership classifications, strategic trophies, and post-war dominance structures. Reed groaned softly. "According to this," he said, "you are technically categorized as Strategic Victory Property Type 7. Kara raised one eyebrow. "I assume there are 6 other types." "Yes." "Should I be relieved?" Reed scrolled further. "Type 3 appears to be captured enemy warships." She nodded. "That is slightly more flattering." Reed sighed and closed the screen. "You know what bothers me the most?" Ka'ara crossed her arms. "The fact that I am listed as equipment?" "That too," Reed admitted, "but mostly that nobody here seems to think it's strange." Ka'ara studied the holographic treaty map floating above the table. "Systems that last for centuries become invisible," she said quietly. Reed looked up. "They stop being questioned." "Exactly." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've seen that before." For a moment the room was quiet except for the hum of the station's life support. Reed stood and walked around the table, studying the massive legal structure hovering above them. The Alliance Treaty System looked like a glowing city built entirely from laws. Layers upon layers of agreements, amendments, and traditions formed a vast network of control. Ka'ara moved beside him. "You are searching for another weak point." Reed nodded. "There's always another weak point." He zoomed in on a specific cluster of clauses. "This section regulates diplomatic sovereignty." Ka'ara leaned closer, her long ears tilted slightly as she read the glowing lines. "Interesting." Reed smiled faintly. "You see it too. If a sentient individual is granted diplomatic advisory status," she said slowly, "they cannot legally be classified as property." Reed tapped the clause. "Exactly." Ka'ara looked at him. "You are planning to make me an advisor." Reed shrugged. "Technically." "To whom?" He pointed at himself. Ka'ara stared at him. "You cannot appoint your own property as your advisor." Reed grinned. "True." He expanded another clause. "But a decorated tactician who ended a galactic war can request an independent strategic consultant." Ka'ara folded her arms. "You are exploiting 3 legal contradictions simultaneously." "Yes. You enjoy this." "Very much." She studied the structure again. "If this works," she said slowly, "the classification system collapses." Reed nodded. "And if the classification collapses, the war asset protocol becomes illegal." Ka'ara was quiet for a moment. Then she gave a small, thoughtful nod. "This strategy is elegant." Reed bowed slightly from the waist. "High praise from a former enemy officer." "You are still technically my captor." Reed blinked. "That is deeply uncomfortable phrasing." Ka'ara almost smiled. Reed walked back to the table and opened another document. This part will be the fun part. She glanced at the screen. You are submitting the request to the Galactic Council. Yep, publicly. Of course. Ka'ara tilted her head. You enjoy provoking powerful institutions? Reed shrugged. I enjoy watching systems fail stress tests. He pressed the confirmation icon. The request transmitted instantly across the station network. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then every communication drone in the chamber lit up simultaneously. Alerts flashed across the holographic displays. Kayara watched the sudden chaos spreading through the diplomatic channels. Your stress test appears successful. Reed leaned back in his chair. Yes. Across the station, officials were already sending urgent messages. Several council members were requesting emergency clarification. One senator had apparently begun shouting. Reed took a calm sip of coffee. Ka'ara watched him. You appear very relaxed. I just launched a legal missile into the center of their political system. Yes, he shrugged. That part was easy. Ka'ara crossed her arms. And the difficult part? Reed smiled faintly. Waiting for them to realize how much damage it's about to cause. The first sign that Reed's request had detonated inside the political system was the sudden appearance of 3 ambassadors in his doorway at the same time. None of them looked pleased. Reed glanced up from the holographic document hovering above his table and sighed. Well, he said quietly to Ka'ara, that was faster than expected. Ka'ara remained perfectly calm beside the window, watching the diplomatic station's traffic lanes. Small transport ships drifted slowly past the transparent hull like patient metal fish. How long did you estimate? She asked. 2 hours. She nodded slightly. It has been 14 minutes. Reed scratched the side of his head. I may have underestimated the panic response. The door slid open with an irritated hiss, and the ambassadors stepped inside as if they were boarding a hostile vessel. Ambassador Velrin, a tall man with silver ceremonial robes, and the permanent expression of someone who had never been wrong in his entire life, pointed directly at Reed. You cannot be serious. Reed looked behind himself briefly. Are you speaking to me? Yes, you. Oh, good, mate, Reed said. For a moment I thought someone else had started dismantling the galactic legal framework. Velrin did not laugh. This request is absurd. Reed leaned back in his chair. Which part? You are attempting to appoint a captured enemy officer as your official diplomatic advisor. Reed nodded. That is correct. Velrin gestured angrily toward Ka'ara. She is classified as a war asset. Ka'ara spoke calmly. For the moment. The ambassador looked as though he had just discovered gravity was optional. You see, he said, turning back to Reed, this is exactly the problem. Reed folded his hands. Yes. Velrin blinked. You admit it is a problem? No, Reed said. I mean the system is the problem. The other 2 diplomats exchanged worried glances. Velrin stepped closer to the table. You ended the war. You are a respected strategist. Why would you damage your reputation by challenging long-standing traditions? Reed thought about that for a moment. Because the tradition is stupid. Silence filled the room. Ka'ara covered her mouth briefly with her hand. Reed looked at her. Was that too direct? A little, she admitted. Velrin inhaled slowly through his nose. This system has maintained order in the galaxy for 3 centuries. Reed nodded. Yes. And you think you understand it better after a few days of reading legal documents? Reed tilted his head. No. Velrin relaxed slightly. I think it's broken after 5 minutes of reading them. The ambassador stared at him. Across the room, Ka'ara's shoulders shook slightly. Reed noticed. You're laughing. No, she said calmly. Yes, you are. I am appreciating your confidence. Velrin looked like he might collapse. You cannot simply dismantle a major legal framework because you disagree with it. Reed stood slowly and walked toward the central holographic display. The treaty system appeared above them again, glowing like a vast web of law. Reed pointed at one section. This clause says all sentient individuals are sovereign entities. Velrin nodded cautiously. Yes. Reed pointed at another clause. This one says captured officers can be transferred as property. Yes. Reed spread his hands. So which one is lying? Velrin opened his mouth. closed it, then opened it again. That is a contextual interpretation. Reed grinned. In military strategy, we call that a contradiction. Ka'ara stepped forward. In my empire, she added calmly, contradictory laws were usually resolved by eliminating one of them. Varen looked horrified. You see, he said, she is the enemy. Ka'ara raised one eyebrow. I surrendered 3 days ago. Yes, but, and technically, she continued, your own laws claim I am now his property. Velren's face turned slightly red. Reed folded his arms. This is why the system doesn't work. The ambassador pointed again. You are destabilizing galactic order. Reed shrugged. It was already unstable. Ka'ara nodded thoughtfully. The war supports his argument. Velren looked between them. You two seem very comfortable working together. Reed glanced at Ka'ara. She glanced back. Reed shrugged. We're both victims of terrible legal design, Ka'ara added calmly, and incompetent coffee. Reed lifted his mug. That too. Velren rubbed his forehead. You are aware that the council will review your request in 48 hours. Yes. They will reject it. Reed smiled faintly. Maybe. Velren stepped toward the door. You should withdraw it before the hearing. Reed leaned against the table. Ambassador? Velren stopped. Yes? Reed gestured at the glowing treaty system floating above them. You know what the funny thing is? Velren waited. I ended a war using a strategy nobody expected. The ambassador said nothing. Reed's voice remained calm. And now you're assuming I don't have another strategy. Velren stared at him for several seconds. Then he left the room without another word. The door closed. Silence returned. Ka'ara looked at Reed. You did not tell him the full plan. Reed sat back down slowly. Of course not. She tilted her head. Do you have a full plan? Reed took a sip of coffee. It's about 60% complete. And the remaining 40? Reed smiled. I'm hoping the council will accidentally provide that part. The council chamber of the diplomatic station was designed to intimidate people. Reed noticed that immediately. The room was enormous, shaped like a hollow sphere, with rows of floating platforms arranged in layered circles. Each platform held a representative of a different civilization. Humans, scaled diplomats from desert worlds, crystalline entities projecting light patterns, and several species Reed could not identify without a xenobiology manual. At the center of the chamber hung a single circular platform. That platform belonged to Reed. Very subtle architecture, he murmured. Ka'ara stood beside him, hands folded calmly behind her back. You believe it is meant to make you feel small. Reed glanced up at the towering ring of observers. It's working. Above them, the council lights brightened slightly, signaling the start of the hearing. A tall council mediator, an elegant being with translucent skin and glowing veins, spoke first. Tactician Elias Reed, Commander Ka'ara of the former Coalition fleet. You have requested recognition of Commander Ka'ara as an independent diplomatic consultant. Reed nodded. That is correct. The mediator's voice echoed softly through the chamber. This request conflicts with established post-war asset protocols. Reed raised a finger. Yes. Several council members shifted impatiently. The mediator continued. You may now present your argument. Reed leaned slightly toward Ka'ara. Do you want to start? She looked mildly surprised. You ended the war. Yes. You should probably open the speech. Reed scratched the back of his neck. I was hoping to avoid public speaking. Ka'ara looked at him. You dismantled an entire fleet command network. Computers don't interrupt you. A quiet murmur spread through the chamber. The mediator cleared their throat. Commander Reed. Yes, sorry. Reed stepped forward. He looked up at the council platforms. Hundreds of eyes were watching him. Reed sighed. All right, let's begin with something simple. He gestured toward Ka'ara. This officer commanded one of the Coalition's strategic fleets. A holographic image of the war appeared above them, showing fleet formations drifting across the stars. She lost the war, Reed continued. That part is very clear. A few council members nodded. But now the Alliance has decided the correct response is to classify her as equipment. The hologram flickered, displaying the glowing legal term, War Asset Type 7. Reed looked up at the council. I'm a military strategist. I like systems that make sense. He tapped the holographic display. This does not make sense. One council member leaned forward. The system maintains order. Reed nodded politely. Yes. And ensures stability. Yes. And reinforces the consequences of aggression. Reed nodded again. All true. The council member folded their arms. Then why challenge it? Reed looked around the massive chamber. Because you're also claiming every sentient being in this room is legally sovereign. The holographic treaty structure appeared above them again. Clause lines glowed across the chamber. Reed pointed at one section. This law says no sentient being can be owned. Then he pointed at another. This one says captured officers can be transferred like cargo. The room grew quieter. Reed spread his hands. Those two statements cannot both be true. Another council member spoke. They have coexisted for centuries. Reed smiled slightly. Yes. Ka'ara stepped forward beside him. Her voice was calm and steady. In my civilization, she said, contradictions of that magnitude were usually resolved quickly. Several council members looked wary. How? One asked. She tilted her head slightly. We removed the flawed law. Reed nodded approvingly. Efficient system. The mediator lifted a hand. Commander Ka'ara, you are not a representative of the Alliance. No, she agreed calmly, but I am currently the subject of its laws. Reed gestured toward her. Which brings us to the important part. He tapped the holographic display again. If Ka'ara is property, she cannot legally speak in this chamber. Ka'ara folded her arms. Yet I am speaking. Reed nodded. So one of these laws is already failing. A ripple of quiet conversation spread through the council platforms. Several diplomats began pulling up legal references. Reed leaned casually against the central console. During the war, he said, I won by exploiting contradictions in enemy strategy. He looked up at the council. This situation feels very familiar. The mediator watched him carefully. You are attempting to force a legal resolution? Yes. And if the council refuses? Reed shrugged. Then the galaxy gets to explain why its laws contradict themselves. Ka'ara stepped slightly closer to him. Her long ears angled forward as she studied the council's reaction. Several members were already whispering intensely. One of the senior representatives spoke. If Commander Ka'ara is granted advisory status, the War Asset Protocol collapses. Reed nodded. That is correct. If a colony needs power, we give them power. If refugees need housing, we build it. Not just temporary fixes. Ishana's voice softened. That was always the plan. Tyler nodded. Good. He lifted a third finger. And third condition. The Queen waited. Tyler glanced at the photograph still resting on the edge of the table. That refugee camp, he said quietly. The one in the photo. Ishana followed his gaze. It was destroyed during the war. I know. Tyler picked up the photograph gently. You said the transport hub in that sector still hasn't been rebuilt. That is correct. Tyler handed the photo back to her. Then we start there. Ishana looked at the picture. The small alien girl with long ears. The thin human boy holding ration bread. For a moment, the queen who ruled a star system looked very much like that young refugee again. I would like that, she said softly. Tyler nodded. Good. He took a deep breath. Well then. He looked up at the massive holographic map one last time. I guess I have a galaxy to repair. Ishana extended her hand toward him. For a brief moment, Tyler stared at it. Then he shook it. The handshake was simple. But somewhere beyond the palace walls, construction fleets would soon begin moving. Reactor barges would travel to damaged systems. Salvage drones would sweep through the silent wreckage of old battlefields. Rebuilding would begin. Tyler looked around the enormous royal chamber. You know something? What? Ishana asked. If someone told me 20 years ago that the girl stealing my lunch would hire me to fix a civilization, he shook his head. I probably would have asked for a bigger sandwich. Ishana laughed again. Perhaps we can arrange one. Tyler pointed toward the holographic map. First we rebuild the transport hub. Yes. Then the orbital shields. Yes. Then the shipyards. Ishana nodded. And after that? Tyler smiled slightly. After that, we make sure no kid in a refugee camp ever has to steal someone's lunch again." For a moment, the chamber was completely silent. Then Queen Ashana spoke quietly. "That," she said, "is the best reconstruction plan I have heard in many years." Tyler looked up at the glowing stars. The mechanic who once ran from war had spent years fixing small broken machines on forgotten stations. Now he understood something he had never realized before. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness, sharing a piece of terrible ration bread, could become the first repair in a much larger system. And now, with a queen beside him and an entire galaxy waiting, Tyler finally felt ready to keep fixing things. "And you are comfortable with that outcome?" Reed thought about it for a moment. Then he smiled faintly. "I just spent 5 years watching millions of people fight a war because systems refuse to change." He gestured toward the holographic law network. "If a broken rule disappears today, I consider that progress." Silence filled the chamber. The council platforms dimmed slightly as members opened private voting channels. Ka'ara leaned closer to Reed. "You appear very calm," Reed whispered back. "I am absolutely not calm." She studied his expression. "You are hiding it well." He nodded slightly. "Military training." Ka'ara looked up at the council again. "What happens if they accept your argument?" Reed glanced sideways at her. "Then you stop being classified as equipment. And if they reject it?" Reed took a slow breath. "Then I start phase 2. Ka'ara raised one eyebrow. "You did not mention phase 2. Reed smiled faintly. "That's because I just invented it." The council chamber stayed silent longer than Reed expected. That silence was not peaceful. It was the kind that felt like standing in the center of a storm, while everyone decided whether lightning was necessary. Above him, the representatives of dozens of civilizations whispered through private channels. Light flickered across their consoles as legal frameworks were opened, cross-referenced, and argued over in a dozen languages. Reed stood on the central platform with his hands loosely behind his back. Ka'ara stood beside him, completely still. After a while, Reed leaned slightly toward her. "How long do these votes usually take?" Ka'ara watched the council carefully. "In my government," she said quietly, "this would take 3 weeks." Reed sighed. "Good news, I brought coffee." "That is not encouraging." Another long minute passed. Then the central mediator lifted a glowing staff. The room quieted immediately. "The council has reached a resolution." Reed inhaled slowly. He suddenly realized his hands were clenched. The mediator continued. "Commander Ka'ara of the former coalition fleet will no longer be classified under the War Asset Transfer Protocol." A ripple of shocked murmurs passed across the chamber. Reed blinked once. Ka'ara's ears tilted slightly. The mediator continued calmly. "The council recognizes Commander Ka'ara as a sovereign individual and grants temporary diplomatic consultant status under alliance law." More murmurs followed, some angry, some relieved. The mediator finished. "Consequently, the War Asset Transfer Protocol is suspended pending full legal revision." For several seconds, Reed said nothing. Then he slowly exhaled. "Well," he muttered. Ka'ara looked at him. "Yes? That worked." She studied the council chamber again. "You dismantled a 3-century law." Reed shrugged. "I prefer to think of it as aggressive editing." The mediator looked down at them. "Commander Reed." "Yes? You may consider the legal bond between you and Commander Ka'ara officially dissolved." Reed glanced at Ka'ara. She looked back at him. For the first time since the ceremony days ago, there was no legal structure standing between them. No classification, no ownership. Just 2 officers standing in the middle of a very surprised galaxy. Reed nodded politely toward the council. "Thank you." The mediator lowered the staff. "The session is concluded." Lights dimmed as the representatives began leaving their platforms. Diplomats immediately started arguing in low voices. Several officials looked extremely unhappy. Reed turned toward Ka'ara. "Well," he said. She folded her arms. "Well." Reed scratched the side of his head. "So, I guess you're free." "Yes." "That must feel strange." "A little." They stood there for a moment as the chamber slowly emptied. Reed finally gestured toward the exit corridor. "Want to get out of here before someone invents a new law?" "That seems wise." The observation ring of the station was quiet. Far below them, the blue oceans of Hestara glowed softly beneath the clouds. Ships moved slowly through the traffic lanes, their engines leaving faint silver trails across space. Reed leaned against the transparent railing. For the first time in weeks, he looked relaxed. Ka'ara stood beside him. "You appear satisfied." Reed nodded. "I ended the war." "Yes. And we fixed the worst part of the victory." Ka'ara watched the ships drifting through the stars. "You could return to Earth now." "I could." "You're famous." "That sounds exhausting." She glanced at him. "What will you do instead?" Reed thought about it, then he shrugged. "I don't know." That answer seemed to surprise both of them. Reed laughed quietly. "For 5 years, my entire life was war strategy." He gestured at the stars. "Now suddenly, the galaxy expects peace." Ka'ara nodded slowly. "That adjustment can be difficult." They watched a large diplomatic cruiser glide past the station. After a moment, Reed spoke again. "You'll probably return to your people." "Yes." "Yes." "Rebuild the fleet." "Probably." He nodded. "That makes sense." There was another quiet pause. Then Ka'ara spoke. "I received an offer." Reed glanced at her. "From who?" "The council." "What kind of offer?" She turned toward him slightly. "They want me to remain here. As a consultant." "Yes." Reed blinked. "That's actually a good idea." "I thought so." He studied her for a moment. "You'd be good at it." "Possibly." Another ship passed the observation window, its lights reflecting across the glass. Reed looked back out at space. "Well," he said finally, "the galaxy might actually survive if people like you are helping run it." Ka'ara tilted her head. "You are not staying?" Reed shrugged. "I'm a soldier. Wars are my specialty." She watched him quietly. "Earlier," she said, "you told the council you were tired of systems refusing to change." Reed nodded. "Yes. You are very good at changing them." Reed sighed softly. "That sounds suspiciously like responsibility." "Yes." He stared out at the stars for a long moment. Then he chuckled. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" "What?" "I spent 5 years winning a war." He gestured lightly toward the station behind them. "And the only victory I actually feel proud of happened in a courtroom." Ka'ara allowed herself a small smile. "History will find that amusing." Reed glanced at her. "So, you're staying?" "Yes." He nodded. "Good." She raised one eyebrow. "You sound relieved." "I am." "Why?" Reed leaned back against the railing. "Because if the galaxy starts inventing stupid laws again, I'm going to need help dismantling them." Ka'ara considered that. "That is a reasonable concern."